I used to think cremation was the safest kind of work you could do. No emergencies. No surprises. Just heat, time, and procedure. I worked the night shift at a small crematorium on the edge of town, the kind of place most people don't realize exists until they need it. After midnight, the building felt less like a workplace and more like a warehouse that had forgotten why it was built. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Stainless steel reflected everything and nothing at the same time. The air always carried a faint metallic dryness that clung to your throat long after you left. By the time this happened, I had been doing the job for years. Long enough for the weight of it to fade. Long enough to stop thinking about names and faces. Bodies became paperwork. Procedures became muscle memory. You learn quickly that if you let yourself feel too much, the nights get longer than they already are. That shift started like every other. One last cremation before dawn. No family present. No service. Just a transfer, a checklist, and the furnace. I remember looking at the clock, 2:17 a.m., and feeling that familiar relief. One more job, then I could sit down, finish my coffee, and wait for the sun to come up. Nights like that were usually quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. I logged the paperwork, checked the tags twice, and wheeled the gurney into position. The furnace door loomed in front of me, dark and solid, like it was asleep. I had always thought of it that way, something dormant until you woke it. I followed the routine exactly as I'd been trained. Gloves on. Controls checked. Door sealed. Nothing about it felt strange. If anything, I was distracted. Tired. My shoulders ached. My thoughts drifted to ordinary things, bills, errands, whether I'd remember to lock my car. That's the truth people don't expect. Even in a place like that, your mind wanders. Especially in a place like that. When I stepped back and started the ignition sequence, the furnace answered with a low mechanical growl. The heat built gradually, then all at once. Flames surged behind the reinforced glass, bright enough to force you to look away if you stared too long. I didn't. I never did. Not out of fear, just habit. You learn where to rest your eyes so the job stays a job. I turned from the chamber and made my way to the small control desk nearby. The chair creaked when I sat down. I took a sip of coffee that had gone cold hours ago and grimaced. Everything felt normal. Unremarkably normal. That's what unsettles me the most now. Because if someone had walked in at that moment, they wouldn't have seen anything wrong. Just a man on a night shift, waiting out the last hours before morning. Just another cremation underway exactly as planned. I didn't know yet that this would be the night that broke that illusion. I didn't know that before the fire was finished doing its work, I would see something that no manual prepares you for, something that made me realize how thin the line really is between routine and terror. At 2:26 a.m., I stood up to check the chamber. And that was when the fire stopped behaving like fire. The furnace I worked with wasn't new. It had been installed long before I was hired, long before digital panels and automatic shutoffs became standard. You could tell by the way it sounded. New machines hum. This one breathed. Low, uneven, like it was alive enough to notice when you were standing too close. During training they told us the basics. Temperatures, timers, safety procedures. What they never mentioned were the habits people picked up after working there long enough. The quiet rules. The things passed down in murmurs, never written down because writing them would mean admitting they mattered. I didn't believe in any of that when I started. But I noticed it anyway. No one liked to be alone in the furnace room when the fire first caught. No one stood directly in front of the viewing glass longer than necessary. And no one, absolutely no one, ever said the name of the person being cremated out loud once the door was sealed. At first, I thought it was superstition. Dark humor mixed with long hours. A way to cope. But even the most practical workers followed those rules without realizing it. They'd look away a second too fast. They'd lower their voices. They'd pause just briefly before turning their backs on the chamber. I once asked an older technician why he always checked the room behind him before leaving the furnace area. He laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that meant anything was funny. Just making sure I'm still alone, he said. Then he changed the subject. The furnace itself had its own personality. That's the only way I know how to describe it. It burned hotter on some nights for no reason. Other times, the heat lagged like it was resisting being woken up. Maintenance logs showed nothing unusual. Engineers shrugged it off. Old equipment, they said. Quirks. Still, there were things that didn't fit. Once, during a routine check, I found a metal ID tag resting on the floor several feet away from where it should have been. Another time, the reinforced glass was fogged from the inside before the temperature was high enough to cause it. No alarms. No malfunctions. Just anomalies. You learn not to ask too many questions in a place like that. The building itself encouraged silence. Thick walls. Long hallways. Doors that closed too softly. At night, the absence of sound felt heavier than noise ever could. Every footstep echoed back at you, slightly delayed, just enough to make you wonder if it was really yours. That night, after finishing the paperwork from the previous section of my shift, I found myself standing in front of the furnace again. The fire was well underway now, steady and contained. I told myself there was nothing unusual about checking it twice. It was part of the job. Still, I hesitated before stepping closer. I remembered something another worker once said during a late shift years earlier, his voice barely above a whisper. Fire doesn't erase everything, he told me. Sometimes it just shows you what was already there. I had rolled my eyes back then. Thought it was poetic nonsense. Standing there now, watching the flames roll and fold behind the glass, that memory surfaced uninvited. I pushed it away. I wasn't scared. I was tired. That was all. I leaned in just enough to confirm everything was operating normally. That's when I noticed the shape inside the fire didn't look the way it should have anymore. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel alone in the room. I told myself not to stare. That was another unspoken rule. Don't linger once the fire has taken hold. There's nothing to see, nothing you can change. The process follows its own logic, indifferent to whoever happens to be watching. So I straightened up, took a step back, and forced myself to focus on the control panel instead of the chamber. The gauges were steady. Temperature climbing exactly where it should be. No warning lights. No fluctuations. On paper, everything was perfect. Behind me, the furnace roared louder as the fire settled into its rhythm. It wasn't a violent sound. It was steady, controlled, almost patient. The kind of noise you stop noticing after a while, like traffic outside your window or a distant train. I had learned to measure time by that sound. How long until peak heat, how long until it softened again. I checked my watch. Only minutes had passed. I tried to busy myself with small tasks. Straightened a stack of forms that didn't need straightening. Wiped a stainless steel surface that was already clean. Anything to keep my eyes from drifting back to the viewing glass. But the awareness of the fire pressed against me anyway, like a presence at the edge of a room. Finally, I gave in. I turned slowly, telling myself this was routine. Just a quick visual check. No different from 100 others I'd done over the years. The flames filled the chamber, bright and fluid, folding in on themselves like waves. Heat shimmered against the reinforced glass, warping the view just enough to make everything feel slightly unreal. I watched for the signs I'd been trained to look for: proper airflow, even burn, no obstruction. That's when I noticed the outline. At first, it was nothing more than a suggestion. A darker shape amid the brightness, distorted by heat and motion. I narrowed my eyes, leaning closer, trying to make sense of it. My brain immediately offered explanations. Fire does strange things. Light bends. Shadows lie. I exhaled, a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then the shape shifted. Not collapsed. Not fell. Shifted. It was subtle, just enough to register. The outline that should have been slack and still appeared to pull inward, as if gathering itself. I felt a flicker of irritation at my own reaction. I was letting stories and exhaustion get the better of me. This was what happened when you work too many nights in a row. Get a grip, I muttered, the words sounding too loud in the quiet room. I stepped back again, breaking eye contact with the glass. My heart was beating faster now, though I couldn't have said why. There was no danger. No emergency. Just fire doing what fire does. I forced myself to look once more. The outline was clearer now, not sharper but more defined. It seemed to hold its shape despite the chaos around it. Flames rolled past, consumed everything else, yet that dark form remained, resisting the blur. I felt a chill crawl up my arms, completely at odds with the heat radiating from the furnace. This wasn't how it was supposed to look. I reached instinctively for the controls, as if adjusting a setting might make the image behave the way it should. My fingers hovered over the panel, trembling slightly. The readings were still normal. Perfect, even. Behind the glass the shape changed again. This time there was no mistaking it. It didn't slump or dissolve. It drew upward, slowly, deliberately, as if responding to something only it could hear. The outline elongated, straightening against the fire, refusing to be reduced the way everything else was. I stood frozen, staring through the glass as the impossible began to take form. And in that moment, with the fire fully lit and the furnace roaring at full strength, I understood something with a clarity that made my stomach drop. Whatever was inside the chamber wasn't being destroyed. It was moving. I didn't scream. That's what surprises me now. I didn't drop anything either. I didn't stumble back or hit the emergency stop. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, locking me in place as if staying still might somehow undo what I was seeing. Inside the furnace, the shape finished drawing itself upright. Not all at once. Not violently. It happened the way a person stands after sitting too long, slow, deliberate, almost careful. The outline straightened against the fire, holding its balance while flames wrapped around it, licking past without forcing it down. My first instinct was denial. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't happening. I leaned closer to the glass, close enough to feel the heat radiating through it, my breath fogging the surface for just a second before vanishing. Heat distortion, I told myself. That had to be it. The brain fills in gaps. It invents patterns when it's tired. But patterns don't adjust. The silhouette shifted its weight. It was a small change, barely noticeable, one side dipping slightly before correcting itself, but it carried intention, balance, control. The kind of movement that belongs to something aware of its own position in space. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the roar of the furnace. I became acutely aware of my hands hanging uselessly at my sides, of the way my shoulders had tensed without me noticing. Every rational part of me searched for a mechanical explanation. A burst of air. A sudden draft. Anything. There was nothing. The chamber was sealed. The burn was stable. The readings on the control panel hadn't budged. Inside the fire, the figure took its first step. It wasn't dramatic. No lunge. No collapse. Just a single, measured shift forward, like testing unfamiliar ground. The movement was unmistakable now. Too smooth. Too coordinated. Flames parted and closed around it, flowing the way water does around a rock. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't a reflex. This wasn't physics. This was motion. The figure paused after that step as if listening. As if waiting for something. The stillness that followed was worse than the movement itself. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body refused. I was afraid that if I moved it would notice. That thought alone sent a wave of cold through me. Notice me. The shape took another step. Then another. Each one slow, unhurried, completely unconcerned with the fire that should have been consuming it. It wasn't trying to escape the chamber. It wasn't reaching for the door. It simply walked back and forth, tracing a short, repetitive path inside the flames. Like pacing. I realized then that there was no sign of pain. No thrashing. No instinctive recoil from the heat. Whatever this was, it wasn't suffering. And somehow that terrified me more than anything else. I whispered without meaning to, my voice barely audible. No. The word felt inadequate, like trying to stop a storm by closing your eyes. The silhouette turned. Not sharply. Not suddenly. Just enough for the outline to shift its orientation. Enough for me to understand that it wasn't moving randomly anymore. It had changed direction. Toward the glass. I stumbled back, finally breaking the spell, my heel catching on the edge of the mat. The clang of my boot against metal echoed too loudly in the room. I braced myself, heart racing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the figure didn't rush forward. It stopped. It stood there, framed by fire, facing me through layers of glass and heat and rules I had always believed were absolute. I couldn't see features. No eyes. No face. Just the unmistakable suggestion of posture. Awareness. The furnace roared on, indifferent. The control panel glowed steadily. Nothing in the room acknowledged what I was witnessing except me. In that moment, a thought surfaced, clear and unwanted. This wasn't a malfunction. And this wasn't the fire creating movement. Something inside the fire was choosing to move. And I was the only one there to see it. I don't know how long I stood there after stepping back. Seconds maybe. Or longer. Time had a way of thinning out in that room, stretching until it no longer behaved the way I expected. The figure inside the furnace remained upright. That was the detail my mind kept circling back to, not that it moved, not that it faced me, but that it stood. Perfectly vertical. Balanced. As if gravity and heat had agreed to leave it alone. I had seen bodies react to fire before. Everyone in this line of work has. Muscles contract. Limbs draw inward. The body changes shape, but it never corrects itself. It never holds posture. This did. The silhouette adjusted again, subtle as a breath. Its outline straightened further, shoulders leveling, spine aligning. The movement was so careful it felt intentional, like someone settling into their own body after waking from a deep sleep. I pressed my back against the cool metal counter behind me, needing the contact, needing something solid to remind me I was still here. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow and uneven. I realized I had been holding my breath again and forced myself to inhale. The heat didn't bother it. That truth settled in slowly, bringing with it a sickening sense of wrongness. Flames wrapped around the shape, flared, collapsed, surged again, and the figure remained unchanged. It didn't flinch. It didn't recoil. It didn't even sway. It stood as if the fire were nothing more than weather. I wanted to look away. Desperately. Every instinct told me to break eye contact, to turn my back and walk out of the room. But another instinct, older, deeper, kept my eyes locked on the glass. The same instinct that makes you watch a car crash unfold even when you know you shouldn't. The figure lifted its head. It wasn't a sharp motion. Just a slight tilt upward, barely perceptible. But the effect was immediate. My throat closed. My hands clenched into fists without me realizing it. That small change in posture carried meaning. Direction. It was no longer just standing. It was orienting itself. I shook my head hard, as if that might dislodge the image, might force my brain back into familiar, safer explanations. Exhaustion. Hallucination. Stress. I had worked too many nights. I had stared into the fire for too long. None of those explanations explained why my skin prickled the way it did. The figure took a breath. I know how that sounds. I can't prove it. I didn't see a chest rise or fall. But the flames around its upper body shifted in a way I'd never seen before, parting for a fraction of a second, then rushing back in. Like something had displaced the air. My knees weakened and I grabbed the edge of the counter to steady myself. The furnace roared louder, or maybe my ears were just ringing. I felt very small all of a sudden. Small and exposed, standing alone in a room designed to erase what I was now watching refuse to be erased. The figure didn't reach for the door. That realization cut deeper than fear. If it had tried to escape, if it had lunged or pressed against the glass, I might have convinced myself it was some final reflex, some last illusion of life. But it didn't do any of that. It simply stood there, centered in the chamber, like it belonged there. Like it had always belonged there. A thought crept in, unwanted and impossible to push away. What if this wasn't resistance? What if this was completion? The posture shifted again, the head angling slightly downward now, just enough to suggest it was looking through the glass, through the fire, toward me. There were no features to meet my gaze, but I felt the weight of attention settle on my chest all the same. I had the sudden, overwhelming certainty that if I moved, it would follow me with its eyes. I whispered again, though I didn't know who I was speaking to. This isn't happening. The words sounded thin, fragile, easily swallowed by the roar of the furnace. The figure remained standing. Seconds passed. Maybe minutes. The control panel beeped softly, a routine notification that should have meant something, should have grounded me in procedure and normalcy. I ignored it. I couldn't look away. Then, slowly, deliberately, the figure shifted its stance. Not to walk. Not yet. It planted its feet more firmly as if preparing itself, bracing not against the fire but against something else entirely. Against me. And in that moment, as I stared into the chamber and felt the unmistakable pressure of being observed, a single thought took hold and refused to let go. Whatever was standing in that fire wasn't waking up. It had already been awake. And it was only now choosing to let me see it. The first step was quiet. That's the detail that still crawls into my thoughts when everything else is silent. I expected some kind of sound, a scrape, a shift, anything to confirm what my eyes were telling me. But there was nothing. Just motion. The figure lifted one foot. Not abruptly. Not hesitantly. The movement was smooth, controlled, like it had done this before. Like walking was not a discovery, but a memory being resumed. The flames bent around the limb as it moved, thinning and flaring in response, never resisting. The foot came down. The figure stood in a new place. I felt something inside my chest break open, a sharp spike of panic I could no longer hold back. My breath hitched, loud in my ears, and I pressed my hand to my mouth without realizing it. I had crossed a line I hadn't known existed, the moment when denial is no longer possible. It wasn't just standing anymore. It was navigating the space. The second step followed just as deliberate. No rush. No urgency. It wasn't trying to escape the fire or reach the door. It wasn't testing the boundaries of the chamber. It was pacing, moving back and forth across the furnace floor in a short, measured path. Like a person waiting. That was the thought that landed hardest. Not trapped. Not panicked. Waiting. My mind scrambled for something, anything, to cling to. I glanced at the control panel again, desperate for some indication of failure. A spike in temperature. A drop in airflow. A warning light blinking red. The display remained stubbornly calm. Everything read as normal. Perfectly normal. I looked back at the glass. The figure had turned. It changed direction without stumbling, without losing balance, without any sign that the fire was affecting it at all. Its movements were economical, efficient. Human. Too human. I took a step backward, then another, until my shoulders brushed against the wall. The room felt smaller now, the ceiling lower, the exits farther away. I realized with a sickening clarity that I had stopped thinking about what I was seeing and started thinking about what it might do next. The figure paused again. It stood in profile now, the outline unmistakable in its posture. Head aligned. Arms hanging at its sides. Legs slightly apart, weight evenly distributed. It looked like someone standing in line, waiting for instructions. Then it resumed pacing. Back and forth. Back and forth. Each pass brought it slightly closer to the viewing glass. Not by much. Just inches at a time. Enough to notice. Enough to make my stomach twist. I wondered if it understood distance the way I did. If it knew exactly how close it was getting. If it was measuring. The fire surged suddenly, flaring brighter, swallowing the figure for a brief, blinding moment. My heart leapt into my throat. I hoped, that this would be it. That the flames would finally do what they were supposed to do. When the brightness faded, the figure was still there. Unchanged. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a warning that I was close to losing control. I had never been afraid in this room before. Not really. Respectful maybe. Cautious. But fear? No. This was different. This was the fear of being seen. The figure stopped moving again, this time directly in front of the glass. It didn't press against it. It didn't reach out. It simply stood there, close enough that the outline filled most of my field of vision. I had the overwhelming sense that the fire was no longer the barrier I thought it was. That if the glass weren't there, if the rules I relied on didn't exist, nothing would stop it from stepping forward. Out of the chamber. Into the room. Toward me. I shook my head, a sharp, panicked motion, as if that might break whatever connection had formed. No, I whispered again, the word trembling now. I didn't know who I was speaking to. The figure. The room. Myself. The furnace roared on, louder than ever, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to another place. All of my attention was locked on that dark shape framed by fire, standing where no movement should have been possible. It tilted its head slightly. Not enough to be dramatic. Just enough to suggest curiosity. And in that moment, as it stood there and then took one final deliberate step closer to the glass, I understood something that hollowed me out from the inside. This wasn't a body reacting to fire. This was something that had learned how to move inside it. And whatever rules I thought governed that room, heat, physics, procedure, they no longer mattered. Because the thing in the furnace wasn't trying to escape the fire. It was learning how to walk within it. And it wasn't finished yet. I don't remember deciding to shut the furnace off. I remember my hand moving. I remember my fingers finding the control without my eyes leaving the glass. Muscle memory took over where my mind failed. I think some part of me believed that if the fire stopped, the movement would stop too. That whatever rules had been broken might snap back into place once the flames were gone. The shutdown sequence began. The roar of the furnace softened, then dropped in pitch, the way a living thing sounds when it exhales for the last time. The flames receded slowly, reluctantly, pulling back into themselves. The chamber dimmed, bright orange giving way to a dull, restless glow. Inside, the figure froze. It didn't collapse. It didn't retreat. It simply stopped mid-step, caught in an unfinished motion as the fire drained away. For a heartbeat, it remained there, upright, suspended in a space that was no longer fully fire and not yet fully dark. Then the glow faded. The lights inside the chamber cut out completely. Silence fell so abruptly it felt physical, like pressure in my ears. The furnace room had never been quiet before. There was always something, fans, hums, vibrations. Now there was nothing. Just me, the sealed chamber, and the sound of my own breathing, too loud and too fast. I stood there, frozen, staring at my reflection in the darkened glass. The fire was gone. The movement was gone. Whatever I had been watching had vanished with it. I waited. Seconds passed. Then more. My heartbeat began to slow, though my hands still shook. I told myself it was over. That the moment the fire died, so did whatever illusion I had been trapped in. The human mind does strange things under stress. I had read about that. I clung to the thought like a lifeline. When the chamber was cool enough, I approached it again. Every step felt heavier than the last. The floor seemed to resist me, my boots echoing too loudly in the stillness. I rested my hand on the latch and hesitated, listening. Nothing. No movement. No sound from within. I opened the door. The interior was exactly what it should have been. Fragments. The remains reduced and scattered in the familiar, impersonal way I had seen hundreds of times before. There was no shape. No outline. No sign that anything had stood or walked or watched. The chamber bore no marks of disturbance. No warped metal. No displaced components. Nothing to suggest that the laws of reality had been bent even slightly. I leaned forward, scanning every inch, my eyes darting from corner to corner. My mind raced, searching for something, anything, that would prove I hadn't imagined it all. There was nothing. The emptiness hit harder than the fire ever had. I closed the door and stepped back, my legs suddenly weak. The silence pressed in around me, heavier now that the furnace was dormant. Without the roar, the room felt exposed, stripped of its constant noise, like a place that had been holding its breath and finally let it go. I stood there longer than I needed to, listening. That's when I noticed something else. The silence wasn't empty. It had weight to it. A thickness that made the air feel charged, expectant. The kind of quiet that follows something significant, something final. I realized then that what terrified me most wasn't the idea that I had seen something impossible. It was the possibility that whatever I had seen wasn't gone. It was simply quiet now. And standing alone in that room, surrounded by the absence of fire and sound, I felt the unmistakable sense that the furnace hadn't erased what was inside it. It had only taught it how to be still. I didn't quit the next day. That surprises people when I tell them the story. They expect a clean break, a dramatic exit, some moment where I walk away and never look back. That's not how it happened. Life doesn't usually give you that kind of clarity. It gives you habits, schedules, rent that still needs to be paid. So I came back. The first night after it happened, I told myself I wouldn't look at the furnace window. Not for more than a second. Just enough to confirm the fire was burning the way it should. I kept my head down, moved through the checklist faster than usual, avoided the reflective surfaces that might show me something standing where nothing should be. Everything was normal. Too normal. The furnace roared. The gauges stayed steady. The chamber behaved like a chamber again. I waited for the dread to fade, for my body to accept that the previous night had been a one-time break from reality, a fluke I could bury under repetition. It didn't. The fear didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, settling into the empty spaces between tasks. A sound behind me that lingered half a second too long. A reflection in the glass that didn't match my movement exactly. The feeling, constant and low, that I was being observed, not watched exactly but acknowledged, as if something knew I was there. I started noticing patterns I couldn't explain. The furnace room felt colder at the start of each shift, no matter the season. The hum of the lights overhead seemed to fade whenever I stood too close to the chamber, leaving me in a pocket of near silence. Once, while logging paperwork, I found myself pausing mid-sentence, struck by the certainty that I wasn't alone, even though every door was locked and every camera showed an empty building. I never saw it again. Not the way I had that first night. No silhouette. No movement inside the fire. And somehow that made things worse. A few nights later, I noticed something small. After shutting the furnace down, I swept the floor near the chamber like I always did. Ash dust, nothing unusual. I remember because I was being careful, almost obsessive, about leaving the room exactly the way I found it. The next night, before I even lit the fire, I saw it again. A faint disturbance in the dust. Not a footprint. Not a mark with edges. Just a shallow drag, like something heavy had shifted its weight and settled back down. It wasn't there long enough to study. By the time I crouched to look closer, it blended into the rest of the floor. I told myself it was airflow. A draft from the vents. My own boots. But I wiped the area clean anyway. The night after that, it came back. In the same place. I stopped cleaning that section of the floor after that. Not because I was afraid to touch it, but because I was afraid of what it meant if I did. Seeing it had been terrifying, but at least it had been concrete. This was different. This was absence with intention. The furnace window began to feel less like a barrier and more like a mirror. I caught myself scanning it for shapes that weren't there, my eyes tracing outlines only to realize I was mapping my own fear onto the glass. I stopped standing directly in front of it altogether. I angled my body away, pretending it was for safety, not self-preservation. Sleep became difficult. When I did manage it, I dreamed of walking. Not running. Not fleeing. Just walking, down long, narrow hallways that never ended. I would wake with the sense that someone had been pacing beside me, matching my steps, staying just out of view. At work, I began to listen more than I watched. The building had its own sounds at night. Settling metal. Distant clicks. Air shifting through vents. I'd learned to ignore them over the years, to let them blur into the background. Now each noise felt deliberate. Measured. Like something moving carefully, making sure it wasn't heard. Once, during a late shift, I heard footsteps behind me. They were soft. Even human. I turned, heart racing, ready to face whatever had finally followed me out of the fire. The hallway was empty. No one on the cameras. No open doors. Nothing out of place. But the feeling didn't leave. It stayed with me, heavy and insistent, as if the sound had been less important than the message it carried. I began to understand something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. The thing I saw that night didn't need the fire to exist. The fire had just been where it chose to reveal itself. And now that it had learned how to be still, how to wait, it didn't need to move anymore. It only needed time. And I had the sinking realization that every night I returned to that building, every step I took through its quiet halls, I was giving it exactly what it wanted. The realization didn't arrive like a sudden revelation. It crept in slowly, piece by piece, until I could no longer pretend I hadn't already reached it. It happened during a night that should have been uneventful. No unusual sounds. No flickering lights. No strange reflections in the glass. The furnace burned clean and steady, exactly the way it was designed to. I completed the checklist, logged the times, and sat alone at the control desk, listening to the low mechanical breathing of the building. That was when it struck me. I wasn't afraid of the fire anymore. The heat no longer made my chest tighten. The roar of the furnace no longer set my nerves on edge. I could stand near the chamber without my hands shaking. Whatever terror the flames once held had faded, dulled by repetition. And that was wrong. Because the fire was never the source of what I'd seen. It was the stage. I stared at the viewing glass, not expecting movement, not even hoping for it. What unsettled me was how empty it looked. Not empty in the physical sense. There were still flames, still motion, but empty of resistance. Empty of meaning. That was when I understood. The thing I saw that night hadn't been trapped in the fire. It had been comfortable there. Fire consumes. It strips things down. It removes what doesn't belong. That's what it's meant to do. But what if there are parts of us, pieces shaped by loneliness, by abandonment, by being forgotten, that fire doesn't touch? What if those parts don't burn away at all? I thought about the cases that passed through this place with no one to claim them. No services. No final words spoken out loud. People reduced to paperwork and silence. I had always believed cremation was a kind of ending. Plain. Final. Now I wasn't so sure. The figure hadn't fought the fire. It hadn't tried to escape it. It had stood there as if the process was finishing something, not destroying it. That idea settled in my chest like a weight. I remembered the way it walked, not hurried, not confused, but deliberate. Familiar. As though movement itself was something it had been waiting to regain. And I remembered the stillness after the furnace shut down, the silence that felt charged rather than empty. The truth began to take shape, and once it did, I couldn't unsee it. Fire doesn't erase everything. Some things pass through it. The nights after that realization felt different. Less chaotic. More focused. I stopped scanning the room for sudden movements and started paying attention to absences. To spaces that felt occupied even when they weren't. To moments when the building seemed to pause as if listening. I became aware of a pattern. Every time I finished a cremation with no family present, no voices, no witnesses, the feeling grew stronger. The silence lingered longer. The halls felt narrower. It was subtle, but it was consistent. Whatever had walked inside that fire wasn't unique. It was just the first thing that chose to show itself to me. That was the most frightening part. I wasn't being haunted because I had seen something I shouldn't have. I was being haunted because I had understood something I was never meant to understand. That this place wasn't just where things ended. It was where what remained learned how to wait. And standing there alone, listening to the furnace hum through another ordinary night, I realized the final, unbearable truth. The fire didn't create it. The fire taught it how to stay. I still work the night shift. That's usually where people stop listening, as if that single fact somehow undermines everything I've said. They expect a different ending, one where I quit, move away, burn the memory out of myself with distance. But fear doesn't always drive you forward. Sometimes it pins you in place. The building hasn't changed. The lights still hum. The floors still reflect more than they should. The furnace still waits in its steel frame, silent and patient until I wake it. From the outside, nothing about this place suggests what I know now. I've adjusted my routines. I no longer stand directly in front of the viewing glass. I angle my body slightly to the side, enough that I can see the fire without meeting it head-on. I don't linger after ignition. I don't speak once the door is sealed. And I never, ever, say a name out loud. Those habits weren't taught to me. I learned them. I've asked myself why I stay. That question comes back to me in the quiet moments. When the building is still, when the fire hasn't been lit yet, when I could walk out and no one would stop me. I tell myself it's practical. Bills. Routine. Familiarity. But that's not the whole truth. The truth is, I don't know what would happen if I left. I don't know if what learned to wait inside that room would stay there without me. Or if awareness, once given, has a way of following its source. Some nights, I wonder if the only thing keeping it contained is the fact that I'm still here, still watching, still respecting the rules I never believed in before. And other nights, I wonder something worse. I wonder if it's waiting for me to leave. Because if I do, there will be no one left who understands how quiet the room needs to be. Some nights pass without incident. The fire burns. The chamber behaves. I log the times and sit quietly, convincing myself that maybe the thing I saw was an exception. A moment. A crack in an otherwise solid reality. Then there are other nights. Nights when the furnace room feels fuller than it should. Nights when the silence stretches too long after a cremation is finished. Nights when I catch myself slowing my steps in the hallway, aware, without knowing how, that something is pacing me from just beyond my peripheral vision. I never see it anymore. That's important. Whatever learned how to move inside the fire doesn't need to show itself now. It doesn't need to stand or walk or press against glass. It knows I'm aware. And that awareness is enough. Sometimes after the furnace shuts down and the room settles into stillness, I feel it most strongly. Not fear, something quieter. A sense of being acknowledged. As if the space itself is aware of me standing there, breathing, waiting. I don't open the chamber right away anymore. I give it time. I let the silence sit. I let whatever remains understand that I'm not rushing it. There's a reason for that. Just once I broke my own rule. I opened the furnace door too quickly after shutdown, impatient to be done with the night. Everything inside looked normal, ash, fragments, the expected aftermath. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something on the floor near the chamber. A faint trail in the dust. Not footprints. Not marks I could explain. Just a subtle disturbance, like something had shifted its weight before settling again. I wiped it away without thinking, my heart pounding harder than it should have. I didn't check the cameras. I didn't want to know. Dawn always comes eventually. The light softens the edges of the building, makes it feel like a place meant for people again. When my shift ends, I step outside and breathe deeply, grateful for the noise of the world, cars, voices, movement. But even then, the feeling follows me. Not attached to the building. Attached to me. I've come to accept something I wish I hadn't. The thing that walked in the fire didn't stay there because it was trapped. It stayed because it had nowhere else to go. And when it learned how to be still, how to wait, it didn't need the flames anymore. Now, every time I return to that room, every time I light the furnace and look away, I know it's there. Not burning. Not moving. Just present. I don't stand in front of the viewing glass anymore. When the fire is lit, I turn slightly away and let the room do what it does best. Stay quiet. Most nights, nothing happens. And that's what scares me now. Because sometimes after the furnace shuts down and the building settles, I feel the floor shift just enough to notice. Not a step. Not a sound. Just the sense that something has finished moving and decided where to stand. I keep my eyes forward. I don't look back. The fire doesn't scare me anymore. It's the silence after it stops that makes me wonder if tonight was the night it learned how to stay still forever.